Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and today we're looking at episode 1 of the Halo TV series. Now, rather than giving a full breakdown of the first episode or looking at the subtle lore, narrative and Easter eggs involved in this first episode, I'm looking to lean a little bit more towards what I'm good at, and that's analysing some of the science and technology aspects of the Halo universe as opposed to just doing basic breakdowns. Of course, if you do want to find that kind of content from me specifically for the Silver Timeline, then please let me know in the comments. But if not, then you can find all of that kind of content with my other fellow Halo YouTubers. Hidden Experience just put out a fantastic breakdown of episode 1, and Halo Canon has done an excellent breakdown of all of the Easter eggs in episode 1. So be sure to pop across and check those out. Again, if you do want that kind of thing from me as well, let me know and I'll see what I can do. But in the meantime, let's look at some interesting points that I just thought were worth noting and that perhaps needed to be expanded upon a little bit to understand a little bit more conclusively. Now, straight off, Madrigal seems to be responsible for the mining of heavy hydrogen. Now, heavy hydrogen actually means deuterium, an isotope of hydrogen with one proton and one neutron at the nucleus. Deuterium, both in the real world and in Halo, is used in nuclear fusion. Initially, it would be a little odd to suggest that they needed an entire separate planet to mine deuterium when deuterium actually has a natural abundance in Earth's oceans. When you actually look at the percentage of how much deuterium there actually is in the oceans, we're talking about 0.01%. And since humanity by the 26th century has spread far and wide to over 800 colonies in the Milky Way, it stands to reason that since Earth is our home world, we've probably completely exhausted Earth's supply of deuterium. It's also interesting seeing the polar opposites in that most deuterium that we're easily accessible to is found in oceans, and yet this mining facility seems to be sat in the middle of a desert. But again, that's not discounting the fact that it's probably mining from an underground water source, so that's by the by. The next point to note is the plasma weapons that the Covenant are using, or specifically the fact that they're blowing off limbs and exploding bodies. Now, you must bear in mind that the plasma weapons are firing plasma. Now, plasma is the fourth state of matter. It's a superheated gas. And in practice this happens somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 Kelvin. So assuming with sophisticated technology you could actually maintain plasma in the air in a coherent blob and fire it through the air without it dissipating and losing its heat on the journey, once it impacted a human being, for example, the sheer heat would flash vaporize the water contained within our bodies. The near instantaneous transition of the liquid in our bodies to gas would be so sudden it would be explosive. So actually seeing scenes like this in the Halo TV series is not only a welcome change from my perspective, in that obviously in the entirety of the Halo franchise thus far we haven't seen this actually take place in any of the games, but we have had it at least roughly described as such in the books. But also it's factually accurate on what would actually happen should a human body come into contact with plasma at that temperature. The next point I thought was particularly interesting is that the insurrectionists are firing their weapons at the elites when they arrived, and it doesn't seem to be actually killing any of them. In fact, in all of that opening battle scene between the insurrectionists and the elites, I don't actually see a single elite fall. Now, obviously the elites have personal energy shields and they're obviously very resilient in and of themselves. But the fact remains is that all of the firepower that those insurrectionists were directing onto these elites wasn't phasing them at all. However, once the Master Chief arrived, he fired his assault rifle at one elite in just a quick burst and managed to take it down, well, surprisingly quickly. The reason why this is interesting to note is that all of the insurrectionist weapons would just be reclaimed weapons that they would have found and scavenged in the battlefield, because they're not funded like the UNSC are funded. And despite the fact that the assault rifle is chambered in 7.62, it lends credit to the idea that there's been advancements in the chemical composition of the charge inside of the bullets, meaning that the explosion that happens in the cartridge when the weapon is fired could be much more powerful and thus send the round down range with much more kinetic force than a modern day comparable 7.62. Now yes, it could just be for the sakes of storytelling to show how fast and viciously a Spartan can take down an elite, but again, considering the array of weapons that were being used by the insurrectionists just earlier, and they didn't manage to take down a single elite, again, it just lends credit to that suggested idea that there's been advancements in those chemical compositions of the charge. Moving on again, when Chief comes across the artifact in the cave, there seems to be circuitry of sorts in the rock. Now, we've actually technically seen this before. Well, we've read this before. In First Strike, a few Spartans and Dr. Halsey find themselves in some old caverns and mines beneath Oni Castle Base after they destroyed Castle Base as an asset denial to the Covenant. They spent 5 days following some crystalline shapes in the walls of the cave, and when Fred was actually having his gauntlet repaired, he touched one of the symbols and it cut his finger, and his blood actually reacted, so to speak, with these symbols, and the symbols started glowing brighter and brighter. I'm theorising what we're seeing here is practically the same thing, but we'll also circle back to that in just a moment. The next big thing that I kind of made note of is Chief's memory, and specifically the terminology used regarding Chief's memories. Admiral Parangoski uses the term sealed. I thought you had those memories sealed. Now, while this could imply a medical or chemical intervention, I don't think it's necessarily the case, and my reasoning goes right back to their earliest days. At the age of 6, they were kidnapped, stolen away from their parents and their homes to be conscripted into the UNSC and turned into Spartans. Now, part of the indoctrination for the Spartans included distraction, keeping them busy, training, teaching, working and sleeping, not giving them time to think about their parents and their previous lives, keeping them busy. The longer that this was pushed and maintained, the less any memories of their previous life would resurface. Now, most of us only have a few scattered memories of life at the age of 6, with exponentially fewer memories the younger we go. If indoctrination and training was pushed as long as it is suggested, no Spartan would have basically any memory of their lives before the UNSC. So is this actually what's happening? That indoctrination has wiped any memory of his life before conscription? Again, we're dealing with a completely different timeline here. We're dealing with a different set of law almost. So while it's perhaps a little bit too easy to compare it to the games and the books, we currently have very little evidence that he doesn't remember anything else about his service, unless I'm missing something glaringly obvious. The only evidence we have is that he can't remember his life before conscription, which, given the period of time that's elapsed and given the distraction techniques in indoctrination, is kind of to be expected. And in some degree then the Forerunner relic, reawakening those memories to some degree, has some interesting connotations, especially given that one particular memory showed him drawing a sketch of this relic, suggesting some degree of, I don't know, premonition perhaps? But again, until we have any other evidence, let's move on. The next thing I found interesting was the suggestion of reducing oxygen to no less than 40% oxygen in the ship to render both Chief and Quan unconscious. Now, initially, this didn't make any sense to me. Normal air only contains 20% oxygen by mass, and when we breathe out, the exhaled gases are about 15% oxygen by mass, meaning that our lungs are only really harvesting about a quarter of the oxygen in air, or overall only 5% of the air at any given time, so dropping oxygen levels to no less than 40% doesn't make any sense, because it's still more than enough than we'd need to breathe. But then I realised we're in a spaceship in space, and suddenly the penny dropped. Now there are still pitfalls to this logic, but maintaining a lower pressure atmosphere inside a spaceship is much easier than maintaining the full 15 psi that we've come to expect at sea level. In fact, generally speaking, an atmospheric pressure of 4.7 psi is commonplace in space activity. However, there is a trade-off and consequence to maintaining this lower pressure. If you maintained a normal air mix at such low pressures, there wouldn't be enough pressure to get the oxygen through the membranes of our lungs and into our blood. So the trade-off is that you increase the quantity of oxygen in that breathing gas. In fact, at 4.7 psi it's generally accepted that it's 100% pure oxygen. So now it suddenly makes sense that there's a 40% threshold, and that there's even a dial inside of the Condor that allows Chief to increase the oxygen in the ship from 40 back up to 100%. However, I did say that it wasn't without its pitfalls, the biggest of which being the bends, otherwise known as decompression sickness or a nitrogen embolism. The fact of the matter being that both Quan and Chief had been breathing normal air on Madrigal. Climbing into a Condor and having the Condor lower the pressure while it goes out into space, if it was done too rapidly, would result in a nitrogen embolism, basically the nitrogen dissolved in our bodies expanding. In order to avoid this, the ship would need to either change the air mix to 100% oxygen gradually over an hour or two, or that both Quan and Chief have to pre-breathe oxygen, pure oxygen, before the ship takes off. I'm inclined to believe that the ship has the systems in place to gradually change the air mix over time, thus mitigating any risk of decompression sickness, because the alternative is just a little bit too humorous and ridiculous to think about, for two reasons. One, Chief and Quan would just be sat in the back of the Condor for an extended period of time with a mask on their face, not talking to each other. And two, technically Quan wasn't even conscious. Next, we circle briefly back to the Forerunner device when Chief touches it and activates it inside of the Condor, and I note that the same circuitry that we saw back in the cave suddenly appears inside of the Condor. Now, I know earlier I said that the circuitry that we saw in the cave bore some striking resemblances to the crystalline patterns that were found in the caves underneath Castle Base in Halo First Strike. And yet now they're apparently appearing on a Condor that has never before had a Forerunner device inside of it. But it leads me to believe that the Forerunner device not only has apparently an EMP effect, but also perhaps something like a hard light generator, allowing it to quote-unquote reach out and interface with other systems nearby. And the final note I make of episode 1 is the Condor's acceleration as Chief flies it up into the upper atmosphere and out into space over Reach. The speed at which the Condor went, or rather the acceleration that the Condor underwent, would have done a few things. One, it should have broken the sound barrier. Two, it would have experienced extreme hull heating due to atmospheric friction. And three, the acceleration and G-forces that John and Quan would have experienced should have rendered the pair of them G-locked, otherwise known as G-induced loss of consciousness. They both should have blacked out. Okay, maybe not the Chief, because he's wearing his Mjolnir Mark 6 and it's got its hydrostatic gel layer, and that would have stopped blood from pooling in its extremities, so maybe Chief would remain conscious, but Quan, she'd be out for the count. Nevertheless, I extremely enjoyed episode 1. There are a few things that I'm still on the fence about, but overall, accepting it as what it is, and that's a completely different timeline, different lore, different canon, different narrative, I'm actually really pleasantly surprised. It's looking really good. I know a lot of people have a lot of very strong opinions about the TV series, so if we can try to keep it respectful in the comments, that would be fantastic. And again, if you want me to cover breakdowns or some canon or some lore or some Easter eggs in the future, let me know in the comments as well. And if you liked what you've experienced here today, hit the like button. Be sure to subscribe because there's more of this lined up, and there's a load of new content coming as well. Take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.
Thanks for watching, commenting, liking and subscribing. I just want to give a quick shout out to my patrons and YouTube members: Spartan10148, my Metarch, Dylan, Falcon X003, Kenwood, Irrefutable Justice, Leon, Neek and Ramiz, my monitors, Alvin, Andrew, Brand, Brian, Cameron, Chris, Darian, Devon, Flaming Halo, Greenblood, Kyle, Legions Lost, Michael, Prophet Bear, Spartan and Wolf, my sub-monitors, my fleet of Strato Sentinels, my diligent enforcers, and all the other awesome people that have jumped aboard to support the channel over at Patreon. Another shout out to Todd Morrison, my Transcendent YouTube member, and just one quick reminder to support us on all major social media channels including Discord. Much love from 00. Take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.